Good morning. Really good morning for me because it's 4 in the morning here. I'm in Brazil, in Amazonia. And welcome to the 11th session. We're going to talk about legal anthropology encounters and legal pluralism, multi-level orders. And Raul and I are going to be the discussant and the chair. The first paper, if my French is not so bad, it's récupérer le terre par récupérer tout, justice épistémique, méthodes collaboratives et anthropologie engagée pour la réparation dans le nord du Cauca. That would be like recovering the land and for recovering everything, epistemic justice, collaborative methods. This will be like compromise anthropology for reparations at the north of Cauca. The speakers are Professor Claire Ange-Marie Coupet, that's Science Pueblos. She's a researcher, and also Belarmino Huella and Taita Lorenzo Turumbala, both from People NASA and People Misak. So you can start, you have 20 minutes, but because we don't have one of the papers, just relax and go.
Merci pour cette introduction. Bonjour à toutes et tous. Ici, dans le cadre de cette présentation, je devais co-présenter avec deux personnes qui font partie du terrain sur lequel je suis allée, donc qui sont Taita Lorenzo et Belarmino. Pour des enjeux techniques, c'était compliqué de pouvoir les ajuster directement pour cette présentation, mais il y a un enregistrement qui va être présenté juste après. Et donc, cette présentation, elle porte sur un enjeu de territoire foncier assez important dans le sud-ouest de la Colombie, notamment sur la question de la récupération des terres, et en fait sur comment la science, les sciences humaines, les sociales et l'anthropologie peuvent apporter des réponses aussi, et quels sont les enjeux épistémologiques et éthiques aussi de ces terrains-là. Donc voilà, là, il y a une vidéo en espagnol de Taita Lorenzo qui justement aborde ces questions-là depuis son territoire. Je ne sais pas si le son fonctionne. Non, le son ne fonctionne pas. No se puede oír. No se puede oír, no pasa nada de cosa.
¿Puedes comentar un poco?
Oui, bueno, la cosa es que c'est compliqué de parler à sa place parce qu'en fait, ce que lui, il apporte pour parler de la situation sur le territoire, mais en fait, il parle de la thématique de la récupération des terres et de comment ça impacte énormément le sud-ouest de la Colombie et quels sont les enjeux derrière d'existence pour la résistance en fait, de ces récupérations-là face à une concentration frontière qui est extrêmement importante sur le territoire. Et en fait, l'enjeu de cette vidéo, c'est aussi de penser des espaces de dialogue où il y a vraiment un enjeu de penser la recherche à partir des préoccupations des premières personnes concernées aussi avec toute une question d'éthique, de redevabilité, d'espace d'échange entre guillemets dans les présentations, quand bien même on est au sein d'institutions académiques. Donc, pour parler un peu de la situation en Colombie, moi, je reviens de mon terrain où je suis arrivée en janvier et il s'avère que le mois de janvier 2024 a été le mois le plus chaud dans tout le pays de ces 30 dernières années. Donc, avec des feux qui ont éclaté un peu partout dans le pays sur un mois. Et aussi la capitale, Bogota, qui le 21 avril s'est vue avoir un rationnement de l'eau assez important. Donc, cette question-là, entre guillemets, de la menace climatique, de l'effondrement de la biodiversité, elle pose des questions à la science qui sont un peu de l'ordre aussi de l'existence, mais la questionne aussi sur ses propres possibilités ou impossibilités de répondre à ces questions-là. Donc, ça me fait reprendre un peu une interrogation qu'il y avait eu de la part de l'Association états-unienne d'anthropologie en 2018 lors d'un congrès à San José qui se demandait face à cette menace imminente, qu'elle soit globale ou locale, en reprenant un peu, qui posait cette question à partir des incendies en Californie en 2018. Elle dit est-ce que l'anthropologie n'est pas oui, le silence planar, entre guillemets, d'héritage colonial et dans quelle mesure elle pourrait répondre à ces enjeux-là sociaux climatique et de biodiversité. Donc la littérature, entre guillemets, scientifique sur la question des liens entre les sciences sociales et l'impérialisme ou le colonialisme, elle est extrêmement riche, notamment dans les années 70. Je vous invite notamment à lire, si vous ne l'avez pas lu, entre guillemets, sur le côté francophone, le livre de Jean Copin, donc Anthropologie et impérialisme, publié en 75. Et l'anthropologiste saoudien Tala Assad dit que la science elle-même n'a pas de responsabilité. Les scientifiques, eux, au contraire, en ont. Donc, pour revenir un peu sur la problématique qui va sous-tendre cette présentation, notamment sur la question de la récupération des terres, c'est aussi dans quelle mesure la science, elle, peut avoir des pratiques d'investigation et de recherche, entre guillemets, qui n'alimentent pas les systèmes d'oppression dans sa praxis et qui contribuent, entre guillemets, à une logique d'émancipation à partir des terrains de recherche. Donc, en fait, sur cette question-là, sur cette problématique-là qui sous-tend toute la réflexion, elle vient aussi énormément de dialogue entre Paulo Freire et Bellux sur la question de la praxis, qui est vue comme une articulation entre théorie et pratique. Donc, pour comprendre un peu au niveau de la méthodologie et du corpus théorique et académique sur lequel moi je m'inscris, donc j'ai beaucoup, en fait, je me suis beaucoup appuyée notamment sur les études de Max Boiron, qui a écrit un livre qui s'appelle Multidisciplinary, qui a été publié en 2021, qui sera d'ailleurs traduit en français en septembre de cette année aux éditions Amsterdamer, et qui aborde la question de la méthodologie et explique dans quelle mesure la méthodologie, c'est une question qui est absolument fondamentale, tant d'un point de vue pratique du méthodologie que d'un point de vue éthique. Et en fait, ce qu'amène cette personne, c'est elle dit la méthodologie est une forme d'être au monde et non pas juste de faire dans le monde. Et en fait, c'est que derrière des questions d'éthique qui sont tellement importantes, elle dit la méthodologie enacts land relation, et donc est une manière d'être en relation avec son environnement, avec son territoire. Et donc, ça pose et c'est pour ça que cette personne se définit avant tout comme méthodologiste, quand bien même elle pratique, elle est chercheuse en géographie et en sciences dites naturelles, sur la question de la méthode comme façon d'être dans le monde. Et cette personne s'appuie énormément sur les travaux de Tuck and Yang qui ont publié Decolonization is not a metaphor, donc ce livre qui a été traduit il y a 2 ans en français, qui disent la décolonisation, c'est le fait de restituer et de rendre les terres. Donc ça fait aussi écho à plusieurs interventions qui auront lieu cet après-midi, notamment de Mélanie Denef qui parle de restitution et de réparation au niveau du foncier. Mais ce que mettent en avant ces chercheurs et chercheuses, notamment Tuck, qui elle-même est autochtone, c'est sur l'utilisation du terme décolonisation en disant la décolonisation, en fait, c'est pas la reconnaissance, c'est pas des politiques publiques, c'est rendre la terre et rendre la matérialité de la terre. Et en fait, ce qui derrière permet l'existence et la résistance des populations autochtones, qui derrière permet l'application de la médecine propre, de l'éducation propre, de l'organisation territoriale, des propres juridictions, etc. Donc, dans le cadre de ces recherches, moi, j'ai fait plusieurs entretiens avec des chercheurs et chercheuses du Sud pour parler de la question des méthodologies et de la collaboration, mais également, j'ai été accueillie par les autorités spirituelles dans le réservoir de l'Eguamilia, donc dans le sud-ouest du Cauca, pour travailler sur cette thématique de la réparation coloniale à travers le prisme de la récupération des terres. Et il faut savoir que la récupération des terres et tout ce que ça impacte aussi d'enjeux légaux, entre guillemets, si je rapporte aussi à cette présentation, ça a été choisi par mon terrain lorsque je suis arrivée là-bas. Donc, pour resituer un peu la situation du Cauca, il faut savoir que la Colombie, c'est le pays au monde où il y a le plus d'assassinats de défenseurs et défenseuses de l'environnement. C'est ce que révèle notamment un rapport de Global Witness qui a étudié les années de 2012 à 2022. Et le Cauca, en tant que tel, est un des départements où il y a le plus d'assassinats, d'homicides de défenseurs et défenseuses de l'environnement au sein même de la Colombie. Donc ici, vous avez l'État qui se situe dans le sud-ouest et en bleu turquoise, c'est la présence des différents guérillas et groupes criminels sur le territoire. Donc à gauche, vous avez la question de l'EMPI, donc c'est l'État Mayo Central, qui est une dissidente des FARC. Au milieu, il s'agit de l'ELN, donc Armée de Libération Nationale, et à droite, la Segunda Marquetalia, qui est aussi une dissidence des FARC historiquement, même si ces guérillas en tant que telles sont souvent en opposition sur le territoire, voilà, elles ont quand même une grosse présence sur ce département. Et la question foncière est complètement centrale parce que vous avez 1% des propriétaires terriens en Colombie qui possèdent 81% des terres agricoles. Donc, pour vous donner un ordre d'idée, au Brésil, on est de l'ordre de 1% des propriétaires terriens qui possèdent 44% des terres. Là, on est de l'ordre de 1,81, c'est le taux le plus élevé de toute la magnitude. Donc, pour parler un peu des chiffres sur quelle sensibilité, ce terrain-là, le nord du Cauca, pourrait clairement être intitulé de terrain sensible. Entre mon arrivée en début janvier et mon départ en mars, si on prend jusqu'à... Moi, j'allais aller jusqu'au 20 mai, donc c'était assez récemment. Il y a 11 leaders qui ont été assassinés dans le Cauca, dont 2 leaders autochtones, 3 personnes qui ont participé à la signature des accords de paix de la Havane en 2016. Et il y a eu 4 massacres avec un total de 14 victimes. Donc ça, en l'espace de 3 mois. Un peu plus de 3 mois. Donc ici, vous avez photo de en fait, ce que sont les récupérations des terres. J'aurais aimé que Lorenzo et Bellarmino en parlent directement, mais en soi, il s'agit par des grosses multinationales, donc, notamment Smurfit Kappa, qui est une entreprise de papier et de carton irlandaise, également par des familles en fait issues de grosses familles qui possédaient des terres, notamment les champs de canne à sucre au moment de la colonisation. Et c'est d'ailleurs ce qui est revendiqué, c'est la réforme agraire. Donc, ce que vont faire ces différentes communautés, Nasa, Musak, mais aussi avec les afrodescendants et aussi avec les paysans sans terre, c'est faire ce que d'autres appelleraient des attaques de propriété privée. Derrière, vont couper la monoculture et vont essayer de récupérer les terres et entamer derrière des processus, des procédures juridiques pour une reconnaissance, entre guillemets, de ces territoires-là. Donc, il faut savoir que c'est aussi des populations qui souffrent énormément de racisme environnemental. Donc, le racisme environnemental est défini par David Peuples comme la protection inégale contre l'exposition aux déchets toxiques et dangereux, l'impact climatique et l'expulsion systémique des personnes de couleur de décision environnementale affectant leur communauté, y compris les activités d'extraction des ressources naturelles qui ont contribué à la vulnérabilité différenciée des groupes à la mort prématurée. Donc, cette question de la vulnérabilité différenciée des groupes à la mort prématurée, elle reprend la définition du racisme de Ruth Wilson Gilmore, qui en parle aussi énormément dans ses ouvrages. Donc, quels sont un peu les résultats de cette enquête et dans quelle mesure on peut réfléchir aussi collectivement à aborder ces sujets et ces terrains sensibles depuis des perspectives méthodologiques, d'éthique, de redevabilité pour penser ces questions de la réparation. Donc, c'est vrai que beaucoup de chercheurs et chercheuses avec lesquels j'ai travaillé s'appuient énormément sur les travaux d'Arturo Escobar, qui est un anthropologue colombien qui est basé à Cali et qui lui dit qu'on doit aborder ces questions-là depuis le sentir-penser, donc avec toute une question du désapprendre, de collaboration, d'unité et de confiance. Et la question aussi de dépasser la ligne abyssale, c'est-à-dire la hiérarchie épistémologique qui est faite entre les épistémologies dominantes et les épistémologies marginalisées, avec tout un processus d'exclusion et d'invisibilisation de ces savoirs. Donc, en fait, dépasser la ligne abyssale, elle se peut se faire aussi que par la collaboration intense aussi avec les terrains et avec toute cette relation de redevabilité. Et il y a aussi cette idée que par rapport à la personne qui est en relation avec la communauté, l'idée, c'est que tout le monde est co-chercheur ou co-chercheuse au sein des processus de recherche. Et en ça, ça rejoint aussi ce que défend Paulo Freire dans la pédagogie des opprimés. Aussi, au niveau de la mise en pratique de cette idée de dynamique relationnelle, réciprocité et dialogue communautaire. Et ça reprend aussi beaucoup les travaux du sociologue anthropologue Orlando Falsborda qui nous parle d'investigation, action, participation. Et ce qui est en soi est très intéressant dans cette recherche, mais dans plein d'autres recherches sur la question un peu des mouvements sociaux et de l'action collective auprès de populations autochtones, c'est que si on regarde la question de la récupération des terres, c'est réellement ce que Eric Wright aurait pu appeler des utopies réelles. Et en fait, il y a aussi une tendance de la recherche à systématiquement parler, entre guillemets, de l'histoire de la domination et de à quel point il y a des violences, etc. Et d'aborder la question de la sensibilité, etc. à travers un discours très fort sur la domination, alors qu'il y a aussi, et c'est ce dont parle Santos, en fait, une nécessité, enfin, il y a un processus d'invisibilisation des formes de résistance sur ces territoires-là. Et donc, pour visibiliser ce qui est invisibilisé par la science traditionnelle, on doit entamer ce que lui appelle une sociologie des absences pour tendre vers une sociologie des émergences. Et enfin, sur la question de l'anthropologie engagée, il y a pas mal de travaux, notamment aux États-Unis, qui parlent de qu'est-ce que ça veut dire, en fait, s'engager en sciences humaines et sociales. Est-ce qu'il s'agit d'enseigner? Est-ce qu'il s'agit de faire de l'activisme? Est-ce qu'il s'agit de collaborer avec son terrain? Enfin, ça pose toutes ces questions-là et on pourra éventuellement dérouler dans les discussions par la suite. Et moi, quelque chose qui a énormément aussi marqué les recherches sur lesquelles j'ai travaillé, c'est la question de la recherche participative sensible et de la recherche-création. Et donc, c'est aussi l'idée d'utiliser des méthodes artistiques pour poursuivre ces recherches, pour ce que Macarena Gómez-Barris dit, contrecarrer la visibilité coloniale, et travailler notamment, par exemple, à travers les documentaires. Et donc, il y a tout un travail de l'image aussi dans la production de savoirs décoloniaux. Donc, c'est ce que défend l'académie bolivienne Kusikanki dans une perspective de rencontre avec les dualismes modernes. Donc, pour conclure rapidement, ce que David Fellow, dans une intervention et dans un colloque qu'il avait fait sur les études critiques sur les thématiques de justice environnementale, lui, il défend en fait le fait qu'on soit innovante dans nos méthodologies pour aborder ces questions-là face aussi au niveau à des niveaux assez sensibles des terrains. Lui, il parle de multiples catégories de différences, donc avec des focales sur les égalités spatiales, la race, la classe, le risque, mais aussi travailler sur le genre, la sexualité, la question des espèces. Il parle d'envisager des recherches multiscalaires, donc avec des analyses très micro à partir du corps et beaucoup plus à des échelles macro, globales et temporelles. Enfin, lui, il parle de questionner les recherches qui sont très centrées sur l'analyse de l'État. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui peut nous interroger, je pense, collectivement, surtout dans un colloque qui est très centré sur les questions de droit. Et ensuite, de penser la question des disponibilités et des indispensables. Et il dit, nous croyons que l'adversaire pour résoudre le problème, cela témoigne d'un manque de créativité et de colonisation de l'esprit. Donc, pour conclure, en fait, la question de la récupération des terres, j'aurais aimé que Lermino Lorenzo en parle plus longuement, mais elle nous pose la question de comment les terrains aussi amènent des questions épistémologiques et d'éthique. Quelles sont les réflexions que peut avoir la science collective au niveau de sa pratique à ce niveau-là. Et c'est aussi ce que disait une des personnes qui était sur mon terrain, il reprenait les mots de Césaire en disant, dans son discours sur le colonialisme, qui dit justement que l'Europe est indépendable, et il pose la question, est-ce que elle, la recherche aussi, est indépendable? Merci d'avoir écouté.
Okay,
Rodrigo?
can you listen to me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that paper. It was really, really on time, everything. So we have the second and last paper of this session by the PhD candidate
Yes.
it's Medes Malaiholo.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm pronouncing very well.
that's fine.
Yeah, I imagine that. See, who is a PhD candidate in international law, transboundary legal studies at the University of Groningen. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few words about a Dutch legal scholar from the 20th century who has a background in international law and actually did a lot of research on indigenous legal systems, in particular the indigenous legal systems in the former Dutch East Indies, which is also known nowadays as Indonesia. What he's known for is what is called adat law. And adat refers to, most of the time in literature, it's referred to as customary law, customary legal systems of the indigenous peoples there. But in fact, it embraces more than that. Adat is basically more than only customary law. It reaches out, it includes a lot of dimensions, also religious matters, custom, a lot. So it's more than that. It is basically that what is not codified. And then the element of law basically limits us to the legal systems. So that what is not right is what we studied, and that then what was sanctioned, because that was basically his definition of law. As soon as the norms are being sanctioned, and as soon as they are effective to the fullest extent in that sense, then we can speak of law. Then law does not sleep, he said in his inaugural lecture. A lot about Van Vollenhoven is not being exposed to the global audience yet. Why? Because most of his works have been published in Dutch. He's known very much for, this is him by the way, he's known for his works on adat law, and he has a background in languages, semantic languages. That's what he studied. That's what he wanted to study in high school. Also law and political science. He had 2 PhDs in political science and in law, because in those days when he defended his PhD, in those days in the Netherlands at least, it was tradition that you would get a PhD both in political science and in law. So he basically had 2 PhDs, and he wrote his PhD, his book, his first academic work, was titled Scope and Content of International Law. And this was in fact the very first work in the Netherlands that organized international law into one single book. Whereas the discipline or the branch was back in those days still studied in a fragmented way. After that, he went into practice. He started to work for a member of parliament, Mr. Van Deventer, who had experience and worked in practice as a lawyer in former Dutch East Indies, and eventually also became the Minister of Colonies. And Cornelis van Vollenhoven followed him as a secretary, and he was exposed to, well, the moral aspects of colonization. Especially, he was influenced by one piece that is called in Dutch eerschuld, and that translates into honorary debt or debt of thought. Ere means honorary, and schuld means debt, fault, or guilt. And that piece was published in 1899 and had a huge influence on Cornelis van Vollenhoven, a lot of other legal scholars, a lot of politicians, and eventually led to the ethical policy in the Netherlands, which then eventually developed into more of a conservative movement, which had this message of the white man's burden. But the origins of this can be traced back to that piece, Ereschuld, and this piece influenced Cornelis van Vollenhoven. At the age of 27, he became professor at the University of Leiden, chair of Adat law, and for 30 years, he devoted his life to defending these indigenous legal systems as legal systems. And he did this in a very cultural sensitive way. How he did this, I'm going to explain in a little bit. Why? Because what I want to share with you is his methodology. And I'm going to share this more from the perspective of an international lawyer, because I am an international lawyer. And Van Vollenhoven, stunningly, also was an international lawyer because he wrote his PhD on the scope and content of international law. But he set this foundation for social legal research in the Netherlands and legal pluralism. But what we see nowadays is that his methodology and the name Van Vollenhoven is very much associated to social legal research, whereas his methodology was very dynamic. He never lost this. He never lost this love and appreciation for also classical legal research. So what I will do, and I have about 10 minutes left for this, if I'm correct, I will devote some time to 3 pieces of the puzzle. The first piece is law and society, which he called the systemic method. The second piece of the puzzle is history, the historical method he calls this, and then also the comparative method. The third piece of the puzzle, which focuses on making comparisons. And having presented these pieces of the puzzle, we can then put the pieces together and look at this dynamic perspective, not last but not least some final remarks. But please bear in mind that I am an international lawyer. I'm also trained in that sense, in the sense of studying international law in a classical way. But what I notice a lot is that I'm diverting more into this, going more into this interdisciplinary approach by fully embracing this methodology. And that is actually also the aim of my PhD project, to find inspiration in old ideas of Van Vollenhoven and present those in new times of international law. So the first piece of the puzzle, law and society. So the systemic method, he called this. This is actually the first, on this slide, you can see the first sentence of his inaugural lecture, which was called Exact Legal Science. And there are 2 important matters that can be highlighted here. First of all, is that he says that law is a science. The study of law is a science. The premises for this he already developed in his PhD, in his book, Scope and Content of International Law. On page 2 of that book, he actually says that science is nothing more than unified knowledge. And that is a very important premise to start off with. Why? Because that allows us to look at law and also approach that as a science. But it also opens the door for cultural sensitive approach, because if science is all what is everything about unified knowledge, that also opens the door for what we call native science. And this is something that he very much appreciated, that he very much respected. Indigenous knowledge in indigenous languages. Secondly, he says that it is a lovable science, so he never lost his love and appreciation for the study of law in the classical sense, because back in those days, in 1901, in the Netherlands at least, law was studied in a classical way. That is to say, the identification of legal norms, the interpretation of these legal norms, and the organization of these legal norms. And the starting point here is always the legal norm and the legal standard. What Cornelis van Vollenhoven said if we look at international law and when we look at law in general, what we see is that law is more than that. Law is in its nature inherently dynamic and always in motion. And to understand this, we need to understand law in context. And the point of departure here would better be the legal communities and the institutions. And that brings us then to another point of departure that allows us for a cultural sensitive approach. Namely, if we start off with the legal communities and not the norms per se, it opens up the door for different cultures and different perspectives, indigenous perspectives, for instance. So what he said is basically, students of the law, dear students of the law, put away your Justinian whitewash brush, these Eurocentric perspectives, and look at law on the other side of the world, because law in Leiden works differently than if you sail to the Pacific. Then you enter into a new realm. This is what he called the systemic method, finding the sweet spot between classical legal research and what we now know as, well, social legal and empirical research. And he tried to find the sweet spot, and he did this by throwing in two other pieces of the puzzle, and those are history and comparisons. So when it comes to history, which is the second piece of the puzzle, history basically forms the foundation for contemporary understandings of the law. And what once said that these families of languages and families of law, where he said that if I do not speak Hungarian, which Chinese languages are abracadabra to me. And the same actually applies to history and law. As soon as I do not understand its history, international law, or even any legal phenomenon, it would be abracadabra to me. Here it should be noted that Van Vollenhoven was not a historian, and he acknowledged that as well. He was criticized for this. He was criticized for this in the 20th century by historians for not using historical methods. But he was very clear on this actually in his work Grotius and Geneva, in which he explained that he was not a historian but a legal scholar, but he found a lot of inspiration in history. Why? Because as soon as we consult history, we start to focus on the trends, the processes, and the bigger pictures. And those are the strengths of consulting history. It's the third piece of the puzzle, which is comparisons. The earlier presented quotes, if I do not speak Hungarian and Chinese, these languages are abracadabra to me, were not presented in isolation. Another sentence was added to this. But if I know nothing about Hungarian or Chinese law, still I shall find in them much that is not altogether unfamiliar to me. And this shows that as soon as we engage with comparative law, as soon as we compare law, we still find these common kinships, regardless of whether we speak Hungarian or Chinese. It also shows the depth of languages here. That language has a lot of depth. These sentences were presented by him to show that doing comparative research as regards languages is different than doing comparative research as regards law. These sentences were presented in these families of language and families of law, which, by the way, is a very interesting piece of work to read, where he built up to this idea of finding unity in diversity. The way how we can structure the world is by structuring the world in families of languages. We could do the same for law, he basically argued. And when it comes to making comparisons, the strength here is that we go to broader levels of abstraction. Most of the time when it comes to making comparisons, the argument is, well, you cannot compare apples to oranges. But as soon as we even start to engage with this exercise, we get to this level of fruit, to this abstract notion of fruit. And that is the strength of making comparisons. So what he basically said was, seek out to the eccentric, don't be afraid of this, and try to compare. Try to find these common kinships, try to find these families of languages and families of law. What is very interesting is that he can be compared, Van Vollenhoven, as a legal scholar, trained in a classical sense, can in fact be compared to Ehrlich and to Malinowski. And for the legal anthropologists, this is quite interesting. And this has in fact been done by Adrian Bentner at the University of Leiden. This is not something that I will discuss here, because first of all, I'm not a legal anthropologist. And
of the Fraunhofer Institute, funny enough, right?
Yeah. But
sorry.
Also, it falls outside of the scope of the basically the presentation here and the paper. But it is very interesting to actually read. I'm happy to share that article with you if you want to. Okay, having briefly discussed these pieces of the puzzle, now putting the pieces together. It could be described as a three-course menu, and in fact, this has been done in 2012. The systematic method, so that first piece of the puzzle, the historical method as a second course, and a third course, the comparative method. Personally, I do not find this approach suitable. Why? Because it presents his methodology in a linear way, as a three-course menu, in a linear sense. That is not legitimate as soon as we start to engage with Indigenous legal systems and the rights of Indigenous peoples in international law. The reason being is that linear ways of thinking and leads us to reducing matters and isolating matters too much. We start to think of the systematic method as one, the historical method as another, and the comparative method as another. Linear ways of thinking very much is represented in Western epistemologies and ontologies, but not so much in Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. These work more in a dynamic sense, circular ways of thinking. This is not appropriate in that sense. And in fact, also this was acknowledged by Van Vollenhoven in his inaugural lecture, because he said with the three methods, the systematic, the historical, and the comparative method, it is not three different subjects. It's the same subject approached from three different angles. And the way how he expresses this in Dutch, by the way, is a four-dimensional experience. Why? Because stoffe means both subject and it means dust or fabric.
Yeah.
And zijde, so drieërlei zijde, three angles or three sides also means three silks. His whole inaugural lecture, Exactly Legal Science, is very interesting to read. How I present it is not in a as a three-point menu, but more in terms of four circles, where we would have the circle of law, classical legal research, where the strength is focusing on the legal norms, interpreting those, and organizing everything, and the point of departure is those legal norms. A circle of society, where the starting point is the legal community or the institutions, and where we start to look for causal links, and where we start to ask different questions. But try to find that sweet spot between law and society. This is where the other two circles, history and comparisons, become very useful, because as soon as we start to engage with those methods, those approaches, the strengths of that, focusing on the processes, the trends, and the bigger picture, and getting to broader levels of abstraction, somewhat can get us into this sweet spot. It pulls us into the middle in that sense. Last but not least, some final remarks. When it comes to studying international law these days, in the 21st century, we do international law and the rights of Indigenous peoples. The starting point should be the legal communities, because it allows us to approach, to employ approaches that are culturally sensitive, where we try to find unity and diversity, and also where the starting point is unified knowledge, which also allows for native science to be respected as a science. Engage with the eccentric, free from thinking and in vacuums. That also allows this methodology. And for the international legal scholar, this is very useful, because it gives a blueprint, basically the homework for interdisciplinarity. And most of the time when we study international law, the way how it is taught at law schools is in a traditional way. The question is, in the 21st century, and especially when we looked at the legal framework, the international legal framework on the rights of indigenous peoples in international law, the question is whether the next generations of students, the next generation of international lawyers, and also the next generation of international lawyers from indigenous descent are well prepared for this. The bridges have to be built. The epistemology, underlying epistemologies are different. We teach law in a linear sense and not in a dynamic way. For instance, a future lawyers working on the rights of indigenous peoples and lawyers from indigenous descent. That does not work. We need to find these bridges. And this is what Cornelis van Vollenhoven's methodology actually offers us. So old ideas in new times. In times when Cornelis van Vollenhoven lost his hope in the Western world, when he wrote the work Du droit de paix, the Bureaucratie, which is a French written work, his last work actually, The Law of Peace. When he lost his hope in the Western world, he put his hope in the hands of the young peoples and future generations of Latin America and Asia. And on that note, I think it's proper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good, also in time. We have a lot of time for discussion. I think we can relax a little. So I'm giving the floor to Raúl.
Okay, Rodrigo, thank you very much. Thank you both of you for your presentations, very suggestive and inspiring. Just want to make brief comments about both, and then maybe we can open a debate and discussion. People here in the room. So, first of all, to Claire, well, you have presented to us like a framework para abordar asuntos de casi la manera de hacer antropología, ¿no? Tú apuestas por esta engaged anthropology, que claro, es un debate clásico, ¿no? En la disciplina, no resuelto. I mean, it's a debate, it's like a position you take or do not take. But my reflection, my thought about that is how you see how it is possible. Well, the classical debate about also you see that the classical debate about next science and compromise, and if you think this compromise with the people you are researching about distort like the results you research, or not at all, or I mean it's necessary to take this position, this ethical position, and you and in your paper, I don't know if in your presentation maybe you speak about that. Talk about not epistemic justice, but epistemic disobedience. You can say more about that. And then the other thing is if you can say a little bit more about the issue of the paper in the Cauca, which some people, about preparation. I mean, my question is, it deals with concierge, with land, also recovering lands for indigenous peoples, for communities, and in the form of hay procesos de titulación de tierras indígenas. Si nos puedes explicar algún caso, to add a little bit more information about that. And the last thing, very brief. I haven't understood well this contrast between disponibility and indispensability, or disponibilidad indispensable. In what context? Referring to what you can say a little bit more about that. And I'm very grateful for your presentation. And merits, I love your presentation, very inspiring, also suggestive. Very hard for us Spanish people to say fun, often difficult to us. But well, you try to recover this the works of Van Vollenhoven and to apply them to the field of social legal studies, and to make or construct an anthropological approach, from my point of view, a very anthropological approach to this field. Yeah. So I want to remark some points and maybe a question for you. Well, I think the first remark I want to make is that I think it's yeah, I agree. It's a very anthropological approach because well, first of all, Van Vollenhoven take the not written law as a proper law, as a real law. Maybe we can say the most real one, yeah, because it's the law which is being practiced by people, so in the real world, so to speak. That's one point. The other one, he's interested in history, as you say. So he sees law as a social dynamic construction, which is very important also, I think, and is a very anthropological way of seeing law, looking at law. Second point, another point is also very maybe more important. He takes as a point of departure the legal actors, not the courts or statutes or whatever. And it's a way of course, understanding law, what is law and what is not. And the other point you make, recovering Van Vollenhoven works, is the comparison as a central point focus of methodology, which is the point I want to focus on and stress, the point of comparison. Because we have a classical debate in legal anthropology about how to make these comparisons in law, and specifically how to avoid imposing our own perspectives and categories, as to say how to avoid ethnocentric points of view when we do comparison in social legal studies. So it's a classical debate. I think you may know the classical debate between Rohan and Mohanan, which is, I think, is a very good resume synthesis of all of that. But what do you think about that? What do you think about this problematic of using what categories Eurocentric to make it light on other legal systems, and referring to these debates methodological and epistemological. So to speak, how can we use Eurocentric legal categories to shed light on these very different legal realities and cultures, legal cultures. So how do you see that, you and for the health, and how you take this issue, this challenge? That's it. Many thanks for you. Maybe we can, Rodrigo, follow up and take some questions on the topic. Here.
Rodrigo?
Yeah.
¿Responden o tomamos alguna pregunta más?
Yo creo que podrían responder ahora, pero con tiempo. I mean, they can address the questions with time. We have time. But I think you covered everything. I mean, what I have in mind, you already covered. And also the floor for the people who are there, also, if they want to precise or ask anything.
Can we say something now or
Respond to your questions and then provide the audience support. Go to that.
Yeah. You want to start with?
You want to go first?
Schrift maken. Well, I think the question of the result is a rare question. And about collaboration, I think it's a topic where there are a lot of discussions, and as you said, it's unresolved. That question about engaged anthropology, because how about when you go on fieldworks where what you observe, you have also a link of domination within the community and whose interest you follow. And that's the thing, it's really unresolved, and that's why I think it's also something we can think about collectively, because in collaboration you always have this idea that your vision makes sense because it is useful for the community from the needs of the community. But what about if the interests are different? What about if there are conflicts, if there are difficulties? What about, for example, gender violence? How do you talk about this in the Indigenous community, for example? Yeah. And I have a friend which studies those topics precisely, and it's really complicated to communicate about this in the results. In the results. So I think there are different ways, and I think it's something that can be talked to and exchanged with the people directly concerned. For example, my friend Richard had research on sexual violence with the Indigenous community. It's something she talks a lot to within the working with religious community. So that I have no clear answers, because it is really complicated, and I think the way to communicate is also very interesting, because a PhD is something that will read the academia. I mean, for the format, because it's 400 pages of like scientific vocabulary on topics, on people, etc., on social worlds. So maybe I think a way of thinking about this and think about the results and how we can communicate is also talk about the format. How can it be something else than a PhD? How can it be a documentary, as a book, in bande dessinée? It can be other formats, and I think that's also interesting about the results and about making science, because when Paulo Freire talks about, I think that everyone is a co-academic, but co-researcher within the research. I think it's not about having something homogeneous, it's more about putting into dialogue different perspectives. And I think a research is really enriched by those aspects. And I think in literature, it's something that is really clear for anthropologists, but it's not that clear. Like, I'm from politics, I studied politics first, and it's something not clear at all, like to put into dialogue those perspectives. And the question of ontology, etc., is something quite new. Nothing is really new under the sun, but at the same time, it's points of reflection that are really obvious in anthropology and not that much knowledge is. So this is about the result. About epistemic disobedience, that's why I didn't talk about it during my presentation. It's because I'm more familiar with the website of Boaventura Santos on cognitive justice. And if I'm not wrong, it's a concept that was theorized by Joe Smith. But I haven't finished the book, so I don't want to misinterpret what she meant. But if some other people want to talk about it, so it's open discussion about the field work with Nasa and Mizak people. I think it's part of the last slide of my presentation when I talk about research creation and methodology, collaborative methodology that use the sensible synthetic methods. And about this idea to ultrapasar la línea del sal de Santos. I think this works pretty well through other types of methods, and especially through the documentary, and I would love to recommend this. Also because what they're telling from the situation of recovering land to recover everything, they also talk about the fact that there's an invisibilization about those resistance, that no one talks about it, or and that the violation of human rights, the number of mergers on this territory is extremely high. And I think there's a real issue of documenting too, of doing through a work of research and about getting showing that it exists, that it is visible, that there are some things really interesting. That I think we have a lot to learn from those utopias, and so I would say that this is a bit of collaborative work more than the thesis, and I think in a sense it talks about the results, and that's what when my friend which does her PhD on sexual and sexual violences in indigenous communities, she says, well, the PhD is for the academia because she's not going to ask me to write about what's happening in this territory. But within the community, she worked on a house to welcome victims of sexual violence within the community, and that was her collaborative work. It wasn't that much the PhD, and so I think these things can be also separated. And about disposability and indisponibility, David Miller talks about it from the body, and it also goes back to what Gilmore says about racism as a vulnerability aumentado premature death, and about the fact that some bodies are disposable and are used as it, and some are indisponible because of race and gender.
Yeah, I can track off a couple of remarks, and the last one a question. So first, when it comes to the first remark is from Vollenhoven's anthropological approach, saying that he has a very anthropological approach towards law. That is indeed the case, because he basically was taught law in a classical sense, but he had a strong background and a strong interest in languages. That was actually the study that he wanted to do in high school. It was his high school teacher who convinced him to study law. So he came in law school with this perspective of languages and other cultures, and languages they reflect epistemologies and ontologies. So there's no way around this. And this anthropological approach is very much identified here in his work. To my view, actually, think already ahead of his time, back in those days, because we're talking about 1898. He graduated in 1897, and he obtained his PhD in 1898. But he was influenced a lot by actually anthropological work, especially by a scholar from Leiden, Christian Snoeker. He was the first one who went to Mecca, not being originally Muslim, right? But do anthropological work there. He was the first one. He also became a professor at Leiden, and he worked together with van Vollenhoven. The correspondence between the two is actually quite interesting, also on a personal level, where Snoeker was very cynical. Van Vollenhoven, in his work, he's very straightforward, and he takes a very strong position. But personally, as soon as the arguments are being thrown at him, especially by his dear friends and his neighbor, literally his neighbor, then it became very personal. But it's quite interesting to look at those works as well and see the connections here and there between Christian Snoeker and Cornelis van Vollenhoven. It was also Christian Snoeker who introduced the term Adat into Western discourses already in the 19th century. The argument here most of the time is that he was the person who invented Adat. Not so sure about this. Also coming from the region, he introduced it into the Western discourse, and van Vollenhoven used that in the Western discourse. But van Vollenhoven did this in a very cultural sensitive way, and this brings us to the other remarks that you made. It's point of departure, indeed, the legal community, but I would take it a step. Even a step back, in terms that he first tried to, from a methodological perspective, first address the question, what is science? Okay. And this is what he did on page 2 of his PhD, Scope and Content of International Law, where he said that it is unified knowledge. And that starting point already allows us for a cultural sensitive approach, because as soon as we say science is not only the exact sciences, or science is not only that what we see and that we can prove by empirical fact or anything, and we'll only focus on the empirical methods, then we start to reduce matters too much. But what he said was the point of departure was science is unified knowledge, and that opens the door as well for native science, native knowledge. And in fact, this is also what native scholars also show us. Gregory Cajet and Leroy Littlebeer are good examples. They literally say in their works, native science is not about technology. Yeah. It is about unified knowledge. So here we can see already that bridges can be built in that sense. He approached law also as so that was also a remark. Law as being dynamic. Also, this idea of studying, or at least how I understand it, the approach that legal anthropologists most of the time take versus a classical legal research, right? Where the classical legal research is more about behind the desk, locking yourself up in the library, right? His approach was actually, what is striking actually, was that he only visited the region 2 times in his life. Yeah. But he got all the data, and he was very good in organizing and systemizing everything in a cultural sensitive way. But he obtained all the data from his PhD students. He had in his 30-year career in academia, he had 78 PhD students. Most of them graduated in Adat law, and he had 8 Indonesian PhD students. And one example of his 8 Indonesian PhD students, which shows his cultural sensitive approach in the beginning of the 20th century, is that those PhD students defended their PhD in the Aula in Leiden. If you studied in Leiden, or if you've been in Leiden, it's a small Aula. Imagine being there, and in the beginning of the 20th century, when colonialism was at its height, there were Indonesian students coming in their traditional ability. That is quite striking in the 20th century for a legal scholar, allowing that. So they defended their PhD in their traditional pluralism. It shows his point of departure, unified knowledge, and the legal communities, the actors. But I wouldn't say that he was an anthropologist, but he was very much inspired by a lot of other disciplines, and he tries to find unity and diversity not only around the world, amongst legal systems, amongst languages, cultures, but also amongst disciplines. He literally has this approach of the world can become your library, which is also somewhat of what we see with indigenous knowledge most of the time. So this is where the bridges can be built, and this is what he offers us already in the 20th century. And this brings me to the question that you asked, this Eurocentric approach, and how to avoid this. Well, he did this very strikingly. I can explain this by an example. His students, the way how he supervised his students was first the point of departure, unified knowledge. As soon as you're not interested in, and as soon as you're not curious, as soon as if you're only here for the certificate, then it won't work, he said. And he was very strict. It won't work. And he literally said in his correspondence to another colleague, this book can be finished by the student. This book can be finished. This small book can be finished in about 2 weeks. But if this is not done, if this attitude is not shown in the next meeting, give up. I'm going to give up. I hope no, it's not going to work. The point of departure was unified knowledge. Was being curious and have that attitude. As soon as his students had that, and especially as soon as the students came from other parts of the world, the next step for him was try to understand them. So he would invite them over dinner, he would go over dinner to them, and he would try first to understand them, try to understand their way of thinking, their points of departure, their cultural background, their language as well. He spoke a lot of languages too, or he still understood a lot of languages. And as soon as he understood that, then he was able to supervise them. That was his approach. So it's this extremely strong bottom-up approach, where he basically said that all knowledge does not come from Europe only, and all knowledge is not obtained in Europe only. It's also in other parts of the world, and we have to reach out to the eccentric, to those. And it's a very, very challenging exercise to do, to put off your own glasses of epistemologies and ontologies. But he basically said that is the whole experience. It's an unfinished jigsaw puzzle that we're working on. But it has to be done in a way where we do not impose our own perspectives on the others. And that was something that, as soon as we start to read his works, that is a common theme that we start to see throughout basically all of his works. One quote actually that I wrote down, I didn't share that in the presentation, was that to define, for instance, indigenous legal systems in terms of European conquest, it's a strange sort of nonsense, he basically said. It is like pressing an indigenous language into the Latin grammar. So it's this point of departure. Unified knowledge is the first point of departure that allows us to look at other epistemologies, ontologies, respect that, and the next point of departure is the legal communities, the actors. And then we have two strong foundations for a cultural sensitive approach, where we can start to remind ourselves, okay, the Eurocentric way of looking at law, for instance, is not the only way and not the Holy Bible, to put it in simplified terms. He also wrote a short piece on this, actually, to convince the Dutch government that the codification of Adat law in the beginning of the 20th century should not be done that was one point, and the second point that Dutch civil law or Dutch private law should not be imposed on other legal systems in the Dutch East Indies. He presented this in his work, and he managed to convince politicians in the Netherlands in the beginning of the 20th century to not do this. This eventually also happened. And one piece that he wrote is literally called No Jurist Law for the Native, where he basically said, yeah, that's in Dutch. That one is in Dutch. Most of his works are unfortunately in Dutch. But his works on other law, the 45 bundles on other law, have been translated by his PhD student in 1981. Yeah, so those can be consulted. And currently, I've translated his inaugural lecture from Old Dutch to English. So we're trying to look at publishing this, getting it out there. But the idea is basically to build the bridges in the 20th century already, what he tried to do. And it's really a shame that he died that early at the age of 59 in 1933. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question? May I, Rodrigo?
Yeah, I think we have at least some minutes for a last question.
Well, it seems to me that we have been trying some centuries for infecting a bit the law with control thoughts, but still there is a fight in the Netherlands, especially in law school, for that. Yet still very rigid. I have a question in relation with Claire, or maybe the both of you, because I have been puzzling with that in terms of legal philosophy. What is the difference, according to you, between cognitive justice, which is a term that was developed not only by the social science, but by many of his students who he doesn't cite many often. Cognitive justice and epistemic justice. The same for the second one. That's not a term that was constructed by him, but by many people that helped him. So it's, when we talk about also this terminology, it is important to recognize that knowledge is not at all and never individual, but it's constructed by many communities. Yes, so a way to decolonize that is to move forward into situatedness and also a communitarian way of constructing knowledge. There is also an important thing that you cited, very important, women, yeah, in the colonial and decolonization. You need to make a difference between that, because the work of Kusikanki is always in friction with the colonial thinking, and the frictions and the fights between Mignolo and Kusikanki are very well known. Because for Kusikanki, coloniality is nonsense. And of course, for the colonial thinkers, as I think I put myself too into that brand, seems to be a bit too drastic, a too drastic critique, although I really appreciate the work of Kusikanki in many aspects. So what is the difference, according to you, maybe between these two things? Because I think that they are part of the same puzzle, but they are different.
Welcome. Thank you for the different questions. I think it's really important that we want to. I've cited Susan because it's how I discovered, but it's not at all about the work on epistemic justice and cognitive justice. And from what I've understood, cognitive justice nourishes the epistemic justice, and I think he makes a difference between epistemologies that are marginalized and dominant epistemologies. And when he talks about justice, it's all about putting into dialogue, from what I've understood, towards ecologia and saberes, and ecology and knowledge. And so I would respond. This is how I would respond, but
I don't have the answer myself.
Yeah.
I don't feel like
No.
I an answer. Except you're not in the dialogue because in the literature is not clear.
Yeah, but I do
sometimes
agree on this.
Both terms gets confused
Totally.
or used in the same way, and I think that there is a difference.
For me, one nourishes the other, but as you said, I think that is what is really confusing in Epistemología del Sur. So one of Sudafranco's major books is that he recites and reuses some works that have been very developed before him, and I think in France and from my formation in academia, he was really a reference. And after going to Latin America, I discovered there was a lot of Az's calls also invisibilized by his work, or by how it circulates to how his knowledge circulates. So thank you for the point about citing.
Yeah, I do not know myself, but I think that for mission you have to be careful with that because it comes from the psychology field. And epistemology comes from knowledge. Now, well, you can be very inclusive by putting knowledge, but still silencing the voices that produce those knowledge and appropriate those knowledge, which is called epistemic extractivism. So I think that we need to be careful and understand how it could be a wonderful paper actually to make a difference between the two.
Yeah.
Sí, es el fin.
Says we have 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I think we are exactly on time.
No,
Yeah,
we have 10 minutes.
Yeah, 1 minute.
I know you want to. We still have 10 minutes.
1 minute. This is Swiss precision. Okay.
Rodrigo, what time is it actually where you're now?
It's in Brazil.
It's 5:15.
Oh no.
That's fine.
Yeah, it's dark outside. But don't worry, it's Brazil. It's really, really hot. So I think everybody wants a coffee. That was an excellent session. Everybody was on time.
No, Rodrigo, de hecho, tenemos que siempre considerar la otra sesión y necesitan 10 minutos más, entonces podríamos aprovechar si es que quieren. Si quieren, tenemos el tiempo.
Absolutamente. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. See, I mean, yeah. I mean, if somebody wants to, I mean, some of the yeah. Carolina.
No.
Sorry, I arrived late, so I actually missed the presentation. But so I have a question based on your title, but you may have already. So we all work. We also work with the NASA, and I was wondering because in the title you speak about récupérer la terre, how you deal with the change of. Now they speak about liberating Mother Earth, and there is a reason also, like a strategic reason why they changed this narrative. And I was wondering if this is something like you are approaching, or how do you approach that with this recuperating land?
Yeah, I think there's some precision that I have to make is because the NASA community is really diverse and there are conflicts, etc. And the sentence de recuperar la tierra para recuperarlo todo is from the ITSO. So it's an organization from southwest of Colombia that is traditionally separated after the. It's just that I don't know how much here there's a knowledge about this because there's already specific answers, but in the Cauca where I was, there's a huge organization, it's called l'ONIC, Organización Nacional Indígena de Colombia. No, disculpa, el CRIC, Consejo Indígena Regional del Cauca. And there was a separation between the CRIC and the ISO, and this is the sentence from the ISO. And the NASA communities I've been working with don't work with the CRIC. And so there are conflicts on this, but they work with the ISO. And they also use the term liberation of Mother Earth to talk about recuperating the land. But with the communities I've been working with, it's not a speech that they use that much because they're more in the vein of the ISO.
Okay, but then you work at two levels, like at the community level, the grassroots, but also like the political, like with the political organization. I mean, not the CRIC, I understand.
Yeah, of course.
And do you see like a difference in then the narratives that go out from the
of course
political?
Clearly because the communities I've been working with, they're in a real conflict with the CRIC. And then they talk about looking at grassroots without corruption, without things that they do project on the CRIC. And they're also not at all appreciated by the CRIC. So but they reivindicate as grassroots movements that haven't been like in political logics but at the same time, when you look at the political importance of CRIC, so it has nothing to do with the CRIC. So, but I work like with grassroots movements, and those movements I've been working with is because they're in the so that's how, in a sense, I got to know them, because at first I was invited by the Misa community.
There is nobody else. For Neres, do you think that the work from Cornelis Holhoven will be at one point after your work taken more into account in the law schools of the Netherlands? Because there are very few thoughts for the philosophy of law, and now it's really pushing forward into decolonial thinking. And the Dutch likes to take terminology very much without too much exploring sometimes. But the colonial school in the Netherlands is becoming more conscious about this and pushing the people into take conscious of what when they enunciate a word, what do you mean by that? For philosophers of law, for me, it is absolutely important to have some consciousness when you are enunciating those kind of terminology, and have a manage as a set of tools, and also a critical mind, a critical thinking when you use those tools. That's, I think, needs to. It's a kind of a resistance sports holding a space for resistance within the academia, and without the neoliberal academia that wants to have fast knowledge, fast everything. Yes. So, but that's the question for me. I met Nedes in another. We got an invitation some months ago to Utrecht to talk together. That was the first time I saw him. And he said something very interesting to me that caught my attention deeply, touching me deeply. He said, we have disobeyed the law because law is cosmic, if I remember well. And then I said, well, this is sounding very working that. So that's my question for you.
Yeah, perhaps this is on the last point. I believe this is more of the background. This is more related to the background that I have, the background that I grew up with, being from Indigenous, growing up with Indigenous principles from East Indonesia. I come from the village of Boys, Papua. You grow up with Adat, but not there. We didn't grow up there, which is different. But they grew up in the Netherlands. But the idea of law being dynamic, animate, cosmic in that sense, is something that is not taught in law schools, and this is, especially in the Netherlands. And this was something that I was struggling a lot when I studied law in the Netherlands, especially in a classical sense. But then running into the works of van Vollenhoven, the first time that I ran into it, I thought, yeah, this is what I always meant. This is what I always tried to express, or this is the homework that actually was necessary. What is, please correct me if I rephrase the question incorrectly, but the question is basically has to do with van Vollenhoven's approach not being very well known in law schools in the Netherlands, and whether there's room for improvement in that sense. Yes, definitely. First of all, it's striking that there is a whole library section at the University of Leiden called the van Vollenhoven section, and there is he's literally on the window in the aula in Leiden when you visit the PhD defenses or anything. He's literally there. He was the dean of the university, the faculty as well. He's by Paul Scholten, a very, very famous legal philosopher and legal scholar in the Netherlands. He said in 1933 about van Vollenhoven that van Vollenhoven was the most universalist jurist in the Netherlands. It's striking that his name doesn't pop up that much anymore. And every time that I present his works, especially to students, always the question is, why didn't we know about this? Why didn't he wrote about international law? Why is he not there in the textbooks? Well, there are good reasons and bad reasons for not including his works into the discourse. But this is something that is going to change in the nearby future, I believe, because also this, especially for lawyers from indigenous descent, especially for students of the law that come from indigenous communities, grow up with these different ways of thinking. What van Vollenhoven offers here is that recognition. That non-linear way of thinking. There is a space for this, where and I actually experienced it with a couple of students of mine whose thesis I supervised. That they told me, why weren't we introduced to him before? He's he apparently is very famous, but apparently he's not being presented in the literature that much. Well, I think it has to do with, first of all, that the language is mostly published in Dutch. And that needs to change, a bigger audience in that sense. But then as soon as next generations of lawyers, and especially those from indigenous descent, are being exposed to his methodology, I think then the ball can start rolling. But what is striking is that his ideas, those ideas that he had in the beginning of the 20th century are very appropriate and are actually being worked on these days. But he did a lot of homework, so it gives a lot of a foundation also for various legal scholars. So I do think there is a lot of potential here. And also, it's good to move away from locking ourselves up in classical legal research and law schools behind the desk. Because when it comes to international law, especially when it comes to studying international law, and when it comes to, especially then also when it comes to studying the international legal framework on the rights of indigenous peoples, you cannot do that from a desk in the Netherlands only.
No, of course not. It's irresponsible.
Yeah.
Yesterday there was a very good panel with Mariana. What is the family name of Mariana? I don't remember. Well, she said something very sensitive about this, because she was complaining, well, legal anthropologists are saying one thing and lawyers are saying some other things. And the problem is that both of them have some portion of the truth. Yes, but the steps for further conversations and working between each other are missing here. And then they commit a lot of mistakes, and the other side commit a lot of mistakes too, and justice is not found. So I think that Mariana, I hope Mariana might be sleeping at this moment, but I would have loved to have her here. What is a real? It's
that is very typical too. What I find, what I see in Western dichotomies dominate a lot. It's an obligation of result, or it's an obligation of conduct. It is a primary norm, or it is a secondary. But what if it is not the case? What if it is not a dichotomy always? What if a good example actually is the image of a duck and a rabbit.
Yeah.
we either see the duck or the rabbit, or the duck or the rabbit. But what if we just focus on the picture? See the picture. And this is striking, because in native science actually shows that very well. Where Western approach is, I see the river and I observe the river, and I see the river and I tell you that there is a river. Whereas the indigenous person would then actually walk with the river, tell you what is going on in that process and how the river is flowing, and he or she goes with the river. And it's a completely different approach. Dynamics are more emphasized. A circular way of thinking rather than linear way of thinking. And this is what I believe what Van Vollenhoven, as a Dutch legal scholar, very much established in the Netherlands, offers us in law schools. Yes. Because it's out there in both Dutch and also in English here and there. And his name is very much established, and that's a good starting point. Where and he's not pleading for the white man's burden to simplify this, but he's very much aware of, okay, don't put on this Eurocentric glasses. Don't use these Eurocentric epistemologies and ontologies as soon as we start to engage with other legal systems around the world.
Maybe just half a minute for the wrap up. I remember one ancestral authority when I was doing my PhD, and they were defending a river. So I was with them, and then, oh well, this is what you are defending. And she told me, what you see is not a river. And then, for one or another reason, there was a sea smell, but we were very far from the Pacific Ocean in that latitude. So I went into the forest looking for that essence. I couldn't find anything. No relation with the river and the essence of the Pacific Ocean. So I went back to the meeting room, to the meeting room, and I said, if for any reason somebody was making fish from the river or something, making a picnic or whatever, no, that's not possible here. Because there was an essence of the Pacific Ocean there. Well, maybe the river that you call saw you. I called you. That was that was the start of the PhD. Yeah, that's the start. What the start? Yes.
So this I may make one final remark. I think that the methodology of Van Vollenhoven very much builds bridges between studying law in the classical sense, as being taught in law schools, especially in Europe, in the Netherlands, on the one hand, and indigenous approaches towards law. So it builds these bridges. There's a possibility to build these bridges for those students of law that have come from indigenous descent to understand a curriculum, for instance, in the Netherlands, but also vice versa, for those students graduating in the Netherlands, for instance, or in Europe or anywhere, and then going out into the world and engaging with other legal systems.
We don't have time.
No, come on.
No, we have to.
That's impossible.
Please, Rodrigo,
Bravo.
I'm going to admit, please.
Bravo, excelente panel. Increíble. Muy buen timing. Me imagino que se van a ir a tomar un café, pero yo lo necesito más que ustedes, porque aquí son las 5:30.
Gracias.
Mis felicitaciones a los expositores. Muy buen panel, lo disfruté mucho. Chao.
Chao.
Nos vemos más tarde.